Something happened on July 4th that no one has fully explained. And if you watch this entire investigation and still walk away without making a choice about whether you care, you need to ask yourself what that says about how much you really believe. Every life deserves the same urgency. A board-certified forensic pathologist has just weighed in on the Nolan Wells case, and what she's saying doesn't match the story we were told. Dr. Judy Melinek is not affiliated with either side of this case. She has no connection to the family, no connection to law enforcement, no connection to the district attorney's office. She is simply a trained professional who reviewed what has been made public and applied her expertise to the evidence. Her conclusion? Drowning is a diagnosis of exclusion. That single forensic principle is the reason Jackson County's early no-foul play statement may have gotten ahead of the science. And the most critical piece of evidence in this entire case, the part of Nolan's body that could actually answer what happened to him, is still sitting in a jar somewhere, unreleased, unexamined by anyone outside the state's control. If you want to see exactly where this investigation goes next, there's one way to make sure you don't miss the update. It takes 2 seconds. It changes nothing about your life, but it changes everything about whether we can keep covering this case with the depth it deserves. Let's start with what a forensic pathologist actually does when a body is found in water. Dr. Judy Melinek explained this directly. Being able to definitively state the cause of death after a body has not been found for several days and has been subsequently autopsied twice with signs of decomposition is incredibly unlikely. That's not speculation. That's a statement of fact from someone who has performed hundreds of autopsies. Drowning is what's called a diagnosis of exclusion. That means when you've got a fresh body, you want to be able to look at the body and see if there's any other causes of death for that body that was found in water that exclude the death being exclusively a drowning. So, for example, if someone is shot and then thrown in the water, you'll have that gunshot and they'll be bleeding and the gunshot will be the cause of death. The water is not the cause of death. It's not even on the death certificate. If a person is strangled and they die from strangulation and then their dead body is thrown in the water, their body will take on water, but the cause of death is going to be strangulation, not drowning. The examiner must work in reverse, eliminating head trauma, cervical injury, toxic substances, internal hemorrhaging, everything first. Only after every alternative explanation has been systematically ruled out can drowning be documented as the determination. That's established protocol. It's not discretionary. The sheriff's media statement bypassed that complete process. He provided the conclusion before anyone had examined the evidence. Within days of Nolan going missing, the sheriff leading Jackson County stood before media and announced there was no foul play involved. At that precise moment, no autopsy had been conducted. No pathologist had assessed the body. The investigation was, by every standard, still in its opening stages. Yet the public received a definitive answer as if the matter was already resolved. You investigate first, you declare second. Here, that sequence was inverted, and once inverted, it's extraordinarily challenging to correct. These victims waited for someone to listen. The least we can do is make sure their story reaches as far as it deserves. Because every subscription is a promise that we will keep digging, that we will not let these cases go cold again. Now consider the timeline. Nolan was a young person who'd been missing for multiple days before his body was discovered in water on July 6th. Each one of those days alters what a body can communicate to an examiner. Decomposition doesn't pause while investigators work. Submersion modifies tissue. Time eliminates details. From the moment Nolan was found, every subsequent hour diminished the precision of whatever analysis would follow, which makes it even more troubling that the public declaration came so rapidly and so definitively, exactly when maximum caution should have been exercised. In fairness, perhaps the sheriff observed something at the recovery location that influenced his announcement, but a scene observation isn't a documented, scientifically validated finding. It's not something an external specialist can assess. A statement delivered on camera holds massive influence with the public, regardless of whether it's scientifically substantiated yet. Once authorities declare accident, that characterization follows the case universally. It determines how vigorously evidence gets collected, how the public interprets emerging information, and how much momentum exists to investigate further. Nolan's family didn't quietly accept that, but they also didn't respond with televised anger. They responded by securing their own independent pathologist and engaging attorney Benjamin Crump, a name recognizable to anyone following cases where families suspect the official account isn't the complete truth. An independent autopsy was executed on July 10th, mere days after Nolan's body was found, providing a separate examiner the opportunity to verify the state's conclusion against the actual physical evidence. But a second autopsy is never a fresh beginning. By the time it occurs, time has already inflicted damage, and in forensic science, time eliminates information rather than protecting it. A body functions as a type of physical documentation, but it's documentation that deteriorates with every hour that passes. In this instance, the body had already remained in water for days before discovery, then underwent the state's preliminary autopsy, and only following all of that did the independent examiner receive their opportunity. Refrigeration decelerates decomposition. It doesn't halt it. Water only compounds the challenge further, breaking down tissue and obscuring details an examiner relies upon. The second pathologist was essentially analyzing a record that had already suffered environmental degradation. The outcome of that independent examination wasn't accident. It wasn't homicide either. It was something more technically precise. Undetermined. That designation gets consistently misinterpreted. So let's be specific about what it genuinely signifies. Undetermined doesn't indicate nothing occurred. It doesn't suggest the family's questions are without merit. It indicates the accessible evidence wasn't adequate to definitively establish any singular explanation. One side provided a rapid, certain answer. The other side, examining far more methodically, acknowledged they couldn't reach certainty at all. That isn't two professionals disagreeing about interpretation. That's a specialist refusing to claim more than the evidence genuinely supports. So why couldn't the independent examiner achieve a more definitive determination? They possessed the expertise. They had the family's complete cooperation. They had the body before them. What they lacked was comprehensive access, because an autopsy can only analyze what's physically available, and in this situation something critical was absent from their examination table. Not lost to decomposition, not eliminated by water, simply retained. You're part of this now. You're watching. You're listening. You're forming opinions. And that means you have a responsibility to see this through. Because the only way cases like this get the attention they deserve is if people refuse to let them go cold. Don't let that investment be for nothing. That absent section was the anterior neck, specifically the internal components forensic examiners reference as the neck block. It had been kept by the state medical examiner's facility and never provided along with the remainder of the body. When the independent pathologists performed their examination, that complete region simply wasn't accessible to them. Here's why that specification matters far more than it might sound. Different death causes produce evidence in different anatomical locations. And when the consideration involves manual strangulation, the evidence concentrates almost exclusively in the front of the neck, not the posterior. The back is predominantly muscle and vertebrae. The front is where the trachea resides, where the principal blood vessels course, and where the physical indicators of compression would manifest if they exist whatsoever. There are three particular things a forensic examiner searches for in situations like this. First, the hyoid bone. A diminutive, fragile, U-shaped bone positioned high in the anterior throat. Unlike most skeletal structures in the body, it's relatively exposed, and in certain manual strangulation incidents, it can break under force. Second, the infrahyoid muscles, the slender muscles descending along the front of the neck, where microscopic blood vessels can burst internally under constriction, producing indicators a qualified eye can identify even when nothing is apparent on the exterior. Third, petechiae, the minute hemorrhages that manifest when small vessels rupture from continuous pressure, frequently discovered in the eyes, the facial tissue, or the cardiac lining. Combined, these three indicators create an identifiable pattern. And pattern identification is the cornerstone of forensic pathology. All three of those indicators exist in the precise region that was kept and never released. Which leads us to Dr. Melineck's recent declaration. A pathologist evaluating the obtainable materials could only identify the clear constraint. Without the anterior neck, you cannot verify strangulation, but you similarly cannot eliminate it. That's the dilemma at the center of this case. It isn't that the evidence establishes anything. It's that the evidence capable of resolving the question was never provided to the individuals attempting to resolve it independently. Now, to be balanced, retaining tissue during an investigation isn't inherently questionable. Medical examiners execute this routinely, sometimes to preserve material for additional analysis, sometimes to secure it as evidence. By itself, retention demonstrates nothing improper. But here's why it remains significant. If the state retained that tissue, the state analyzed that tissue, and whatever they discovered from it exists somewhere in the initial autopsy documentation, a document the public still hasn't accessed. The retention itself isn't the controversy. The secrecy surrounding it is. The world looked away for too long. Don't look away now. A subscription says you won't let that happen again, because the only way we honor Nolan's memory is by refusing to let his story be forgotten. There's a secondary complication in this case that appears straightforward on paper and isn't. The toxicology. A figure on a laboratory report appears objective. But one specific measurement can be profoundly deceptive without anyone being dishonest about it. Blood alcohol concentration. In a recent case, a blood alcohol measurement typically represents exactly what it suggests. But this wasn't a recent case, and that transforms the calculation completely. Following death, as a body initiates decomposition, bacteria become operative, and those bacteria can generate alcohol independently, completely separate from anything the individual actually ingested. In bodies that have experienced substantial decomposition, this endogenously produced alcohol can escalate sufficiently to exceed a legal standard. Based exclusively on bacterial metabolism, not conduct. Considering that Nolan's body remained in water for days before discovery, any toxicology measurement associated with alcohol requires interpretation with that decomposition incorporated, not accepted at nominal value. A meticulous examiner considers the extent of decay, verifies corroborating chemical indicators, and calibrates appropriately. Anyone interpreting a raw figure as confirmation of intoxication without that framework is operating with an insufficient picture. Dr. Malinik explained this directly. If the body is decomposed, you have to subtract some of that alcohol because it may have been caused by bacteria and may not have been a sign of intoxication. And you can have up to a 0 gram percent. So 0.08 is above the legal limit in most states for driving. But you can get up to a 0.20 in a massively decomposed body, so it really throws you off when you have decomposition and alcohol to try to figure out whether there was alcohol on board or whether all of it's just been made by bacteria. There's also a procedural dimension to this story, distinct from the forensic specifics. At one juncture, a journalist appeared personally demanding direct responses instead of depending on indirect communications. The demeanor had observably transformed. Initial confidence had been substituted with a considerably more ambiguous statement. The case continued under active investigation. Observe the inconsistency contained in that. You cannot concurrently characterize something as a resolved accident and portray it as actively under investigation. If it's still being investigated, it was never as finalized as it originally appeared. When challenged for particulars, authorities provided minimal beyond evasion, redirecting toward other agencies rather than responding directly. This is where wider questions began developing among the public, not allegations, simply justified concerns. In a compact county, authorities regularly know one another and function within the identical interconnected system. That alone isn't misconduct, but it does present a reasonable question about how assured the public can be that an investigation remained completely independent when the individuals executing it are personally affiliated. That question is exactly why independent verification exists initially, and why the family pursued a second evaluation at all. Every person who subscribes is a witness, and witnesses are what the dead deserve. You're not clicking a button for us. You're clicking a button for Nolan, for his mother, for every family that will ever have to wonder whether their loved one's life would have mattered more if they'd looked different. So here's the current situation. A problematic toxicology measurement that demands context to interpret accurately. An official declaration that moderated substantially under direct challenge. A family requesting only for openness, not accusation, and a public questioning whether the investigation process itself can be relied upon from within. Two distinctly different issues, one grounded in science and one grounded in procedure. But they both return to the identical absent record, the initial autopsy documentation, which nobody outside the state has viewed. There's a substantial difference between a case being unsolvable and a case being incomplete. Unsolvable suggests the answers are permanently gone. This case is incomplete because the answers still remain. They simply haven't been disclosed yet. Three particular actions would advance this case forward. At first, the original autopsy documentation itself, the state's recorded findings that could clarify the body's condition and validate why specific tissue was retained initially. Second, the retained cervical tissue, which hasn't been destroyed, merely withheld, indicating an independent credentialed examiner could still analyze it directly if provided complete access. Third, a comprehensive and appropriately interpreted toxicology analysis, one that incorporates decomposition rather than displaying a raw measurement devoid of framework. None of these demand conjecture. They demand disclosure and availability, nothing beyond that. To be entirely balanced, no offense has been established here. Nobody has been prosecuted. The independent determination remains undetermined, and nothing in this presentation asserts otherwise. What's uncontested is that a determination was announced publicly before the analysis was even finalized, and that singular action is what initiated this complete discussion. The family isn't insisting on a suspect or a prosecution. They're requesting something that should be considerably simpler to supply. Recorded, disclosed, confirmable truth, disclose the documentation, provide access to the retained tissue, complete the toxicology appropriately. Whatever the evidence demonstrates, whether it indicates an accident or something altogether different, the family merits a resolution they can genuinely trust. Now let's talk about the discoloration. The thing about the second autopsy that really stood out to Dr. Melinek was that 12 by 8-inch focal area of red discoloration in the deep soft tissues on the back of Nolan's head. There were no lacerations of the overlying skin or fractures on the skull, according to the report. So what could have caused that discoloration? Dr. Melinek explained. The second post-mortem exam was done on a body that had been several days from being found. So we're dealing with, I believe, 2 days between when Nolan Wells was first missing and when his body was found and then autopsied, and another 4 days that have passed until the second post-mortem exam. So the body is decomposed. It falls apart after death, and discoloration could be a sign of injury like bleeding, or it could also be a sign of some sort of pressure being applied potentially during the first autopsy itself. This particular location on the back of the head is a common area where we place a block during the first autopsy, and that may have been the source of the discoloration. It may have absolutely nothing to do with trauma. The only way to know is to get pieces of tissue under the microscope, and that is something Dr. Mitchell, the pathologist who did the second autopsy, is going to be doing to look to see if that discoloration is bleeding or hemorrhage. Why might the initial autopsy not have included dissection of the back of the head where that discoloration was found like the second autopsy did? Dr. Melinek addressed this too. In part, a first autopsy pathologist might not autopsy that area or dissect that area because they don't see anything on the surface of the skin when the body is fresher. So they don't suspect that there's any trauma there. And they may have other parts of the body that have significant findings that they're focusing their attention on. So it's not unusual for a second autopsy pathologist who is given a body that is starting to decompose to work harder to look at areas that the first pathologist may not have looked at. Because when the body was fresh, they didn't see any external signs of injury. If this case stayed with you, if the questions about the neck bother you the way they bother us, then you already know what you need to do next. Because stories like this don't continue to be told unless people like you choose to care. So could this case come down to the toxicology report? Dr. Melinek doubts it. It's not a single report that answers any question. It can give you a piece of the puzzle, but you really need the scene and the circumstances. What is going to make or break this case is going to be the police investigation. Finding out exactly how he got into the water, whether he was alone, or whether there were other people with him at the time. That's going to make the difference in terms of determining whether it was an accident, as in an accidental drowning, or potentially a homicide. That's a critical point. The autopsy can tell you what happened to the body. It cannot tell you how the body got into the water. That's the investigation's job. And that investigation is still ongoing. Let me tell you what I believe. I believe that every life deserves the same urgency. I believe that when a young man dies under circumstances that don't add up, the system should move with speed and transparency. I believe that families shouldn't have to beg for answers. I believe that the color of your skin shouldn't determine whether your disappearance makes the news or whether your death gets investigated with the seriousness it deserves. Nolan Wells was a son, a brother, an athlete, a young man with a future. He cooked for his family the night before he left. He was planning for the fall. He was looking ahead. And, somewhere on Horn Island, on July 4th, something happened. Something that hasn't been fully explained. Something that the system has been slow to investigate. Something that has left a mother grieving and a community demanding answers. If you watch this whole investigation and still feel like you owe something to Nolan's memory, to his mother, to the cause of justice, then I don't know what to tell you, but I know you're still here. I know you've invested the time. I know you care enough to have made it this far. The question is, what are you going to do about it? You stayed until the end. You heard his name. You learned what a forensic pathologist says about the evidence. You understand why the neck tissue matters. You know what the discoloration could mean. And you understand that the most critical evidence in this entire case is still being withheld. Now do the only thing that makes sense. Subscribe. Not for us, for Nolan, for his mother Christine, for every family who will ever have to fight this hard just to get the truth. Because the world looked away for too long in too many cases, and we're here to make sure that stops. Every subscription is a promise that we will keep digging, that we will not let these cases go cold again, that we will not let Nolan Wells be forgotten, that when the grand jury convenes, when the investigation concludes, when the truth finally comes out, there will be people watching, people who care, people who refuse to let the story end when the headlines fade. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment with your thoughts on what the forensic evidence reveals. We read every single one. Your voice matters. Your attention matters. Your commitment to justice matters. Because Nolan Wells mattered, and the only way we honor his memory is by refusing to let his story be forgotten. We'll see you in the next one. This case is still developing. The grand jury hasn't convened yet. The cause of death hasn't been finalized. The neck tissue hasn't been released for independent review. But we'll be here when it does, and we hope you'll be here with us. Because that's what justice demands. That's what families deserve. That's what it means to be part of a community that refuses to look away.